Some folks have very strong opinions on which is the best sword. Others have diverse interests and find something to like about pretty much any sword. Either way, the question, which is the best XYZ, is awfully reductionist. You can make it a little bit more useful by specifying which is the best XYZ for ABC purpose. So today I want to make a few suggestions that I think would be good choices, maybe even the best, for specific scenarios when you're starting out in practicing historical martial arts. Historical European martial arts in particular. Not just because that's what I know the most about, but also because there is such an overwhelming variety. Okay, enough preamble, let's get into it. We're just starting out, you're a fresh newbie, there's so many things to consider. So I'm going to give you a few suggestions for specific scenarios. So first off, availability. If there is a HEMA school in your area or within reasonable driving distance, chances are they're not going to teach every single sword, but they're almost guaranteed to teach longsword. It's the most popular, and there are plenty of good things to say about it. It's reasonably beginner-friendly, it's highly technical, but people may find it a little bit easier than some single-handed swords. Not simpler, it's more complicated because you're using the other hand and there's a wide variety of techniques, but less physically demanding potentially. Obviously, strength and fitness is always useful. It's a martial art after all, but they typically require a bit less grip and forearm strength than many other swords, particularly rapier. And of course, longsword is fun, but we're talking historical martial arts. It's all fun. But I wouldn't say it's the best choice for beginners for two reasons. One, cost. The sword itself is going to cost you more. If you're going with a synthetic, it's not as bad, but still a certain amount of cost. But the gear is pretty expensive. You need a sturdy fencing mask. You need the best, most protective gloves or gauntlets you can get. You need a fencing jacket, etc. It all adds up quite a bit. And the second downside is the reason why you need so much protective gear. The injury risk is higher. That only applies if you spar, and especially if you want to participate in tournaments. That's where the injury risk is highest. If you're doing technique drills and light sparring, perhaps it's not that big of a deal. In general, the injury risk in HEMA is not as high as you may think. If you look at a variety of different sports, they all have certain injury rates, particularly things like rugby or American football. So considering that you're getting hit with swords, the injury risk is not that high. But as said, with longsword, a little bit more broken fingers and such can happen, particularly if you don't have the best gauntlets. What about the opposite end? The cheapest option to start with. So affordable that you can't shake a stick at the price. Single stick. This is awfully long for a single stick, but it's the same material, rattan. They're cheap, easy to replace, easy to use. The only problem is, at that point, you're not really practicing sword fighting, you're practicing stick fighting, which carries over to an extent. Things like footwork and timing and measure and strikes and parries and all of that. Yeah, and a lot of people enjoy single stick sparring because it's fast and dynamic, but at the same time, it doesn't require that much protective gear. Fencing mask, gloves, that's it pretty much. Joint protection, I would recommend, but it's not quite swords. It doesn't have the feel of a sword. Edge alignment is not a thing. You can't practice that. And you can't do a lot of things, like thrusts, for example. You can't really do with these. A better option, in my opinion, and if I had to pick just one best choice for beginners, as reductionist as it is, I'd say Dussack. Why? For one, affordability. Again, if you're going with a nylon Dussack, they're like 30 to 40 bucks. It's pretty cheap. If you get the leather one, which has some advantages, I'll mention that in a moment, it's around $100, which again is not that bad. Definitely less than other swords. And again, you don't need much protective gear. With the leather version in particular, same as single stick. You need a mask, gloves, joint protection, elbow and knee guards. That's it. Oh, a cup. Do not ever spar without a cup. Really, the main reason to wear groin protection is so that you don't get hit in the groin. The one day you forget to put it on, that's where you're going to get hit. Nylon practice swords are the most affordable. They're easier to start with because they're lighter than steel. So as your muscles get used to the new movement patterns, it's going to take less of a toll on you. You can focus more on technique itself. They're very durable, pretty much impossible to break. So there are plenty of good things about them, but these days I much prefer practicing with steel, mainly because these are awfully slippery. You know, if you think about sharp edges would stick and bind, whereas these they slip and slide all over the place. There are some that are made with a serrated shape to bite a little bit, which is, you know, artificial, of course, because it's not quite the same as a sharp or even blunt steel blade for that matter. Blunts obviously don't bind as much as sharps either, but a little bit more so. But also, of course, they handle a little bit differently. They just don't feel quite the same, and there may be some artifacts and some bad habits that you may develop from practicing with them potentially. And some of them are not safe for thrusting. Like this one here is so rigid, I would not suggest using thrusts in sparring. But if you're the experimental type and like to try out unusual things, there are so many different synthetic practice swords. I mean, you can even get a Kopesh and plenty others that you don't normally see, and for cheap too. Back to the Dussack. I like the leather-wrapped ones in particular because they don't have the problem of slipperiness that synthetics have. The leather actually has some friction and it will bind a little bit. It does stick a little bit more than synthetics do. And also it cushions the blow more as well. So as I said, you really don't need much protective gear with this. With some of the hard synthetic ones, you might need a little bit more. These here, no problem at all. And there's a guard. Of course, your hand can still be hit from the sides, but the knuckle guard in front is nice to have. So these are great. You know, if you don't want to spend that much, there's definitely plenty to be said about it. Thrusts still are not good with these in sparring. Like, yes, it's got this floppy tip here, but that's not really going to do anything to keep you safe. If you take a powerful thrust with that, with minimal protective gear, not safe. So you are limited to cuts. There is something good in that for beginners, just in the sense that you can focus on one thing. I mean, at first you're going to be focusing on footwork. You're going to be doing footwork drills until you're sick and tired of it, because that's the foundation. Without a solid foundation, you're not really going to be able to do much of the sword swinging because everything else falls apart. But if you're in the beginning, focus on just cuts, you know, just the basic cuts, you know, just the old diagonal, you know, and the defense against that, you know, for both sides, you know, you practice that first, and then you can add more different angles. So you can, you know, add the rising cuts and horizontals, and then eventually you get to the fancier stuff, and it gets more fun from there. By the way, the Dussack may look weird, but it's the historical training analog to this. If you know how to use this, you know how to use that. You can say that to an extent about Dussack and Messer too. A lot of techniques carry over from one to the other. There's some overlap, although there are also things that are different. Like there are some techniques with the Messer that rely on the Nagel, which again, you might be able to do with this, not with the leather wrap type, but there are synthetic Dussacks that have this too. Paul Meyer, for example, shows a Dussack with such a guard that could be used in the same way as a Messer. The only reason why I would recommend a Dussack over a Messer for beginners, you can absolutely start out with either, but really the only reason is these here. You know, the leather wrapped ones, they're quite useful. They're much cheaper than a steel Messer. If you want to do Messer, I would definitely recommend steel over nylon, but again, it's a matter of affordability and protective gear. One of the reasons to start out with a single-handed sword is it keeps things a little bit simpler. Just because you're only focusing on one hand. The other hand just stays out of the way. In fact, usually, said you put it on your back or on your hip, it's not even in the game. There are grappling techniques, of course, but you're not really going to do that in the beginning. So you can just focus on one hand, and depending on what exactly you're practicing with, the footwork may also be simpler. I'll get back to that in a moment. So the reason why I recommend Dussack or Messer over arming sword, which is also single-handed, so same benefits, right, is that the main manuscripts for arming sword teach you arming sword and buckler. So your other hand is doing something. And in fact, it's more complicated than longsword because your two hands need to move more independently of one another. You know, on a longsword, you use the other hand, but they're moving as a unit. Whereas sword and buckler, they're much more independent. Well, to an extent, there are plenty of techniques where you keep the buckler together with your sword hand, but you know, there's still a little bit more to coordinate, and sword and buckler is highly technical. Yeah, longsword is too, but I would say sword and buckler might be even more technically challenging. And it's also more difficult because, as I said, using a single-handed sword is a little bit more challenging for things like edge alignment and all that. On top of my head, I can't think of any manuscripts that teach the use of an arming sword with nothing in the offhand. There are manuscripts that describe the use of a single sword with nothing in the offhand, but usually that's rapier or side sword or basket hilt. Speaking of which, if you have a bigger budget to work with, it doesn't get much better than Highland broadsword. You know, basket hilts are fantastic for obvious reasons. You don't even really need a glove here. I mean, a glove like this is still good, but you don't actually need a heavy protective gauntlet. And the other hand, again, stays out of the way for the most part, unless you're grappling. So you don't need as much protective gear in that way. And there are also certain techniques that you don't even need to consider. With other swords, there are additional challenges in that you need to keep your hands safe. There are certain things that you can or cannot do. With this, really not much of a concern. You can still be hit in the wrist or in the forearm, but there's so many ways the hand can be threatened with other swords that is just completely negated with this. And particularly if you're practicing regimental Highland broadsword, the footwork is simpler too, because it's linear. You know, it's meant to be used in formation with someone behind you, left and right. So there's not going to be circular movement. There's not going to be passing steps. You don't have to think about which foot is forward. If you're right-handed, your right foot is forward. That's it. Whereas with other swords, beginners often get confused about which foot is forward. Unfortunately, the answer is it depends. It depends on what you're doing. If you're practicing regimental broadsword or in fact military saber, it might be simpler in that regard. But maybe you don't want simple. If you appreciate highly technical fencing, Rapier is your game. But I wouldn't call it beginner-friendly exactly. For one, because the cost of entry is higher. When it comes to the sword, you need less protective gear, but the sword itself is going to cost more. And if you have any kind of physical restrictions, like, for example, you have limited mobility in your arm, or you have lower grip and forearm strength, that's not really a good option. It may not seem so bad at first, but after an hour or two of technique drills and sparring, your forearm and wrist and hand is going to be toast. So if you have any such limitations, small sword is where it's at, in my opinion. Again, it's highly technical, but it's not physically demanding. I mean, again, it's a martial art. Physical fitness is always involved to some extent, at least if you're sparring. If you're doing technique, you can absolutely practice that without exerting yourself enormously. It's more about manual dexterity and speed and all that. Of course, it's going to be a lower body workout, always is. Like with any sword, really, you're going to feel it mostly in your legs in the beginning, especially. Overall, you don't need as much strength for small sword as you do for rapier or other single-handed swords. So that's definitely a good option. And small swords tend to be a little bit cheaper than rapiers as well. And again, they require minimal protective gear. And also the injury risk is much lower. Now, a rapier thrust with protective gear is not really a problem either. I would recommend a fencing jacket. There are cuts with rapiers, and even though it's a narrow blade, sometimes they do pack a bit of a punch. And that's about it. There are other options, of course, and again, you choose what you're most interested in and also what's available. That should about cover it. This is probably pretty long, but I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for watching, and take care, folks. Stay safe.